The war between Ukraine and Russia radically changed the security needs and elements in Eastern Europe for a long time. Neutral Finland and Sweden had to take drastic measures in the face of Russia's aggression. This situation led the two countries to become members of NATO. Despite Finland joining the alliance, Sweden is still pending with Finland's NATO membership. Last week, tensions rose in the Baltic and Nordic regions. In the face of this move, the Russian army immediately carried out a comprehensive navy drill in the Baltic, and at the same time, the tension was taken to the next level. When the Russian ambassador in Sweden announced that the Scandinavian countries had now become Russia's legitimate targets. A critical response from Sweden to this move of Russia came without delay. The reckless statements of Russia lost their effect with the warnings of Sweden. Let's take a closer look at the developments that increased the tension between Sweden and Russia. When Finland and Sweden applied for NATO membership last spring, Russia's reaction was negative, but quiet. Vladimir Putin's reaction consisted only of words, not actions. With Finland's acceptance of NATO membership, Russia's northwest flank became a NATO border. This will increase even more when Sweden joins the alliance. Fearing this possibility, Russia hardened its style even more. Sweden's Russian ambassador, Viktor Todor-Intsev, made statements on the embassy's website. Viktor Todor-Intsev noted that joining NATO makes the Scandinavian countries a legitimate target for Russian retaliatory measures, including military ones. In addition, the Russian embassy accused Sweden of becoming an American colony and criticized the country's support for Ukraine. The Russian embassy also claimed to have received an increasing number of letters from Swedes supporting Russia, but refused to publish them. Already, Russia had long threatened Sweden with appropriate military technical measures if it tried to join NATO. The threats of the Russian ambassador, on the other hand, almost bumped into Sweden's harsh warnings. The Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs is summoning the Russian ambassador to protest the blatant attempt to interfere. Swedish Foreign Minister Tobias Billström reported that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will summon the Russian ambassador to make a clear statement against this obvious attempt to influence. Billström said Sweden sets Sweden's security policy. No one else does. For now, it's not possible to predict how the tension between Russia and Sweden will end. New developments in the future will enable us to comment more clearly. Now let's broaden our perspective a little more and consider Sweden's support for Ukraine. Since the beginning of the war, Sweden has provided critical military aid to Ukraine. It provided long-range anti-tank missiles, RBS-15, coastal defense systems, long-range Archer howitzers, light tanks, millions of military ammunition and equipment to the Ukrainian army. Sweden has also several times increased its military ammunition production capacity for Ukraine. In January, the Swedish administration, one of the supporters of Kiev, announced its huge military aid that will create an event on the world agenda. The striking news has been one of the most effective steps to be taken for Ukraine at the moment. Sweden has approved the delivery of Archer 155mm self-propelled howitzers to Ukraine, according to Swedish Foreign Minister Tobias Billström. Ukraine should acquire as many assault weapons as possible to attack Russian troops, and Sweden should do its part. However, in line with this statement, the Swedish government did not share with the media the exact number of Archer's self-propelled guns transferred to Ukraine. According to the same reports, it's estimated that 18 self-propelled artillery mounts of this type will be delivered to Ukraine in the first shipment. When used with several self-propelled gun crews, these artillery installations can offer highly effective offensive potential of up to 12 155mm caliber shells due to their high rate of fire. The timing of the supply of such weapons to Ukraine is unknown. However, given Sweden's previous statements of intent to supply arms to Ukraine and the timing of deliveries, the transfer of these Archer self-propelled guns is likely to take place very soon. The Stockholm administration also announced that it will send 50 CV-90 armored vehicles and in-law portable anti-tank missiles to the Ukrainian armed forces. Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson announced that Sweden will send CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles, Archer artillery systems, and Enlo anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. Speaking at a press conference, the Prime Minister stated that his government has argued on a three-part military support package for Ukraine, including the first decision to start the delivery of artillery system, Archer to Ukraine. Earlier, Sweden announced its plans to send the ingeniously developed Archer artillery system to Ukraine. But the information about the CV-90 combat vehicles came as a surprise to everyone. At the same time, according to Swedish Defense Minister Paul Johnson, the government aims to hand over all weapons and provide training for the Ukrainian army in the next few months. Sweden's aid to Ukraine is enough to anger the Russian leader. Russia has announced that it will make military reinforcements near Sweden and Finland, both in response to this act of cooperation between Sweden and Ukraine and against the risk of Sweden joining NATO. Also, given the continuing need to focus on the war against Ukraine, Moscow has now relied on gray zone tactics to undermine NATO's position in the region. As it is known, explosions in the Nord Stream submarine pipelines in the Baltic Sea in September 2022 caused heavy damage and initiated separate investigations in 3 different countries. Pipelines connect Russia and Germany. The incident, which Swedish authorities had previously confirmed to be an act of deliberate sabotage, spawned several theories regarding the identity and affiliation of the alleged criminals who were allegedly involved by a pro-Russian US and pro-Ukrainian group. The Kremlin, the White House, and the Ukrainian government vehemently denied involvement. Mats Lundqvist, the prosecutor who led the Swedish investigation, said these speculations have no bearing on the ongoing investigation, which is based on facts and information emerging from analysis, crime scene investigations, and collaboration with authorities in Sweden and other countries. Sweden is investigating after 2 of the gas leaks occurred in waters within its exclusive economic zone. Sweden's insistence on NATO, Russia's threats, and the Ukraine war continue at full speed. So what can NATO do in this situation? NATO's new enlargement creates the need to manage both the short-term and long-term evolution of the Russian threat. In the short term, NATO should plan to increase defense and resilience against hybrid threats. NATO may want to further demonstrate its willingness to respond proportionately to hybrid attacks attributable to Russia in response to Russia's growing nuclear threat. NATO should review its nuclear stance, including expanded deterrence and the role of nuclear weapons in escalation management and war preparations in nuclear fallout-affected environments. The alliance should also plan to control the conventional threat posed by a resurgent Russia in the Scandinavian Baltic theater without taking unduly provocative steps. The integration of highly capable Swedish and Finnish armies into NATO will bolster the alliance's regional deterrence stance, but more can be done. This should include changing the alliance's command structure, reviewing the contingency plan in the region, improving the Swedish and Finnish reinforcement infrastructure, holding new large-scale exercises in Northern Europe, and developing capabilities such as air and missile defense and intelligence in the High North. The accession of Finland and Sweden could significantly increase regional stability. Still, the alliance cannot ignore the risks that come with it. These steps will help ensure that NATO is ready for any response Russia has in mind. We'll have to wait and see how the Scandinavian countries' accession to NATO will affect the Ukraine war. Follow us to be informed about new developments instantly. Thanks for watching. Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov has reacted harshly to Vladimir Putin with the recent increase of troubles in the Russian army after the recent developments on the Bakhmut front. He declared war against Putin while this move was supported by many people in the country. The troubles and the Russian army were revealed so clearly for the first time. The reactions against Putin are gradually increasing. There have been shocking developments in the Russian-Ukraine war in recent days, with Putin losing his largest minority army. The battle in Bakhmut stood out among these developments, and focus was on this region during the last period of the war. Ukrainian soldiers have reached an important stage by mobilizing their resources for this region. This changed the course of the war, and Putin was at a loss during the Russian-Ukrainian war. It was known that the Russian army was in deep trouble, but Ukraine's deliberate withdrawal exposed these difficulties. The difficulties, especially on the hot front, triggered Kadyrov's critical decision, and he finally declared war against Putin. One of the most important problems of the war was the class differences within the Russian army, which led to the humiliation of the Chechen people. The Russian army and the Wagner mercenary group often turned a blind eye to the humiliation of the Chechens, which affected other factors of the war. In the last few days, the Russian army, which had fought shoulder to shoulder many times before, began to send Chechens on riskier missions with a low probability of success. But the latest move in Bakhmut has inflamed Kadyrov's anger. Kadyrov, known for his criticism of Russian leader Putin, has not made any anti-Putin speeches until now. However, in his latest statements, he expressed words of hatred and anger against Putin. It was a known fact that Putin could not manage the groups within his army well. In addition, the successes and certain victories of Ukrainian soldiers were disturbing not only Chechens, but also Russian soldiers. As a result of the brief withdrawal of Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, the Russian army felt a sense of victory. However, the victory of the Russian forces in Bakhmut was rather artificial. It was known that the Ukrainian army would soon return for the spring operation and launch a massive offensive up to the Russian borders. Therefore, the Russian army in Bakhmut had to move cautiously at all times. However, the order from the Kremlin was such that it caused discomfort in the entire army. It turned out that by order of President Putin, the Wagner mercenaries who were to fight alongside the Chechens and the Russians were to be assigned to the vanguard. As a result of these appointments, it was reported that Chechens would also be among the vanguard groups. Chechens who could carry out the first attack and inform their friends from behind the front line were identified. However, this was met with a backlash among Chechens. After this controversial decision, Kadyrov also reacted and took a striking decision. He announced that many Chechens had switched sides and were fighting with Sheikh Mansour Battalion in Ukraine because of Putin's wrong decisions in this region. If such policies continue, according to Kadyrov, it is quite possible that all Chechens will defect to the other side. His statement that Chechens will fight at the front, even in areas such as Soledar, where hot fighting is still ongoing, shows that Putin is reluctant to back down. The fact that a Chechen group opened fire on the Russian army on the Bakhmut front proves that the claims are undoubtedly true. However, given that the Ukrainian army is expected to take advantage of the situation, the war may soon be over. These critical developments raised Putin's concerns, and he decided to take a radical step. Putin realized that even the most basic units of the army would have major problems and would be vulnerable to possible attacks by fully equipped Chechens. This meant accepting a victory, and therefore Putin incorporated the Chechens into other units of the Russian army. The Russian leader also reacted to one of his key supporters, businessman Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was fully behind his strategy to abolish the logic of separate battalions. Prigozhin has expressed his views that the groups formed in the Russian army should be treated differently depending on their location, and has reacted harshly to Putin for not accepting his ideas. These statements by Prigozhin, who has been criticizing Putin since the beginning of the war for the selection of caterers, have raised great curiosity about how brave he is and what trump card he has against Putin. On the other hand, research on this issue shows that Putin made a big decision to gain the upper hand against the Ukrainian army. From the beginning of the war, Putin faced a shaky economy and great hardship. His constant efforts to send aid to Ukraine accelerated Putin's decline. After such events, Putin realized that Ukraine no longer had the slightest hope and changed his approach. The hiring of the Wagner mercenary group for use in places like Bakhmut caused great concern about how it would be paid for. But recently, Russia's sinking economy has led to a different solution for Wagner. Despite his lack of success in Bakhmut, Putin has begun to take steps to turn the tide of power in his favor, showing that he will stop at nothing to achieve success despite the loss of many soldiers. The fact that the Bakhmut region is close to mineral deposits and many economic zones was the only reason for Putin to continue the war in this region, which was not successful enough due to the defeats he suffered against Ukraine. This fact attracted worldwide attention and is still being talked about. The war in the interior of Russia, which started because of Putin's personal ego, has caused a huge backlash because of the wasteful expenditure of the population. The fact that Wagner sent many inexperienced Russian soldiers to their deaths in order to make a profit caused sadness among the Russian people. As a result, the Ukrainian army had the opportunity to win bigger victories against the Russians because when Putin started to lose the war, he started to lose control. It has been widely reported in the Russian media in recent days that Putin is finding it increasingly difficult to make critical decisions due to the ugly tactics that used against the Ukrainian army. And the war has been criticized by analysts. The fact that Putin is far from winning the war not only raises the concerns of experts, but also shows that he has moved far away from his assertive stance when he first entered Ukraine. According to this trend, a significant change is expected in the world order as a result of its troubled circumstances. Ukraine has achieved a serious success pushing Vladimir Putin into a corner. And this situation has evolved to a different point in favor of the country. While Putin is having a hard time with the effect of many important ammunition in his hands, the tendency of the Russian army to withdraw from the region shows the whole world how serious the difficult conditions we are in. Therefore, Ukraine's success is likely to cause even the slightest resistance in Russia to grow. The Russian army will no longer be able to take military action if such difficulties continue. This is just one of the critical issues that could lead to a rapid Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. This has started the fight against the war, and has now created the possibility that Ukraine can succeed in even the slightest attempt against the Russians. The petition in Russia has reached more than 2 million people in about 2 weeks. And this shows the whole world who is the winner of the war. If Ukraine wins this war, it could pave the way for Putin's resignation, which would be a very critical moment in Russian political history. All in all, this petition is very important. This struggle between both sides of the war opens a new era in the dusty pages of world history. This period sheds light on how the Ukrainian army dragged the Russians into a swamp, both in the Donbass and on the southern front lines extending to the Crimea. Kiev is carrying out a simultaneous offensive plan to liberate Crimea and disconnect the Donbass region and Putin's army from the borders of both Belarus and Russia. Since the last few weeks, we have witnessed the offensive activities of the Ukrainian army, especially in Zaporizhia, Berdyansk, Melitopol, Crimea, and the Russian cities around this peninsula. What about the latest situation on Ukrainians' eastern front lines? In the last few days, the Ukrainians have been idling the intensity of ground offensive activities on the southern front lines. Moscow perceived this war strategy of the Ukrainian armed forces as a period of pause. Currently, Russian officials were describing the Ukrainian advance on the southern front lines as insufficient. Normally, Russian officials describe the pause of the Ukrainian army in the trenches of the battlefield as a negative situation for Kiev. But we understood from the incredible activity on the eastern front lines that this was a brand new offensive tactic in Kiev in the past days. The Ukrainian army started sudden and harsh offensive activities in the vicinity of Bakhmut, where it took the initiative, which even the Russians didn't expect. The Russians acted to make up for the gaps in these front lines. After Wagner forces withdrew from Bakhmut and its environs, the Russian armed forces dispatched reinforcements to the city of Bakhmut and the positions near the city. But as Ukraine controls both Bakhmut and supply routes close to the city, more than 100,000 Russian soldiers fell into the net of the Ukrainian armed forces on their way to Bakhmut after the withdrawal of Wagner troops from Donbass. The Russian Army's 1st Army, 2nd Army, and pro-Russian Chechen Special Forces are taking place in Bakhmut and its surroundings. There are around 42,000 troops in the Russian 1st Army and 46,000 in the Russian 2nd Army. In addition, the total number of pro-Russian Chechen forces in the region and the 1st Tank Army of the Russian Army and other support units is around 15,000. The Russian 1st and 2nd Army, formed from the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, has been feeling the power of Ukraine for months after the breathtaking offensive of the Ukrainian forces in both Luhansk and Donetsk. 2 regions are operationally besieged, and thus 100,000 Russian soldiers are stuck in the middle of CNM. Soldiers of Russia's 72nd Motor Brigade near Kaliska, south of Bakhmut, were among the units that fell prey to the Ukrainians. If you remember, the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Anna Maliar, reported that the last of the Ukrainian forces advanced 1,200 meters towards Kleshchev and 1,500 meters towards Kuranivka, south of Bakhmut. Maliar also announced that Ukrainian troops still control the southwestern outskirts of Bakhmut, but the most intense clashes are now around the city. Therefore, thousands of Russian soldiers could not pass through the city and reach Bakhmut as the Ukrainian army finally took control of Kazivka. When the Russians failed to supply troops from Kaliska to Bakhmut, the Moscow administration wanted to send reinforcements to the fortress of the war, this time from a different front line. Colonel Sergei Sharavathy, spokesman for Ukraine's eastern forces, announced that a Russian Air Force regiment was transferred from Lyman to Bakhmut, but these units were allegedly under heavy attack by Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians had almost blocked all entrances and exits to Bakhmut while watching the war behind closed doors. Putin began to realize that he had lost. When the gates of hell are closed, we will have to take into account the Russian soldiers who remained inside Bakhmut, because it's estimated that about 50,000 Russian soldiers are fighting in the city of Bakhmut at the moment. In addition to this number, if we consider the Russian reinforcements trying to reach this city from the vicinity of Bakhmut, we can clearly see that a total of 100,000 Russian soldiers are under the blockade of Ukraine. Among the Russian troops who wanted to reach the city of Bakhmut, news continued to come from the front lines in the north of the city. Even though the Ukrainians tried to completely shut down the transportation to the city, the Russians didn't give up and continued to spend their soldiers on transporting them to Bakhmut. Russia's 106th Air Assault Division, located near Verkhovka, was among the teams moving towards the fortress of the war. This journey, which Kiev called the Death Voyage, was very risky for the soldiers of the 106th Air Assault Division. The reason for this was that the Ukrainians took Markivka back from the Russians and created an effective defense and attack network in a city. For this reason, the soldiers of the 106th Air Assault Division of the Russian Army could not reach the fortress of the war. Bakhmut continued to be of particular importance to both sides. Russia occupied most of the town in early June 2022 after fighting for the town for a year. Ukraine has since attempted to retake the city by encircling it from the north and south. But the current situation of the city has never been more difficult for the Russians. In other words, in Bakhmut, which the Ukrainians are trying to take back in time, it seems that Kiev is now having a say, because lastly, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that its forces had seized the strategic initiative in the city of Bakhmut and carried out a large offensive action, forcing the Russians to leave the positions they occupied. US Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley announced that the Ukrainians were advancing to 500 and 1,000 meters per day on the eastern front lines and up to 2,000 meters in some eastern trenches. This is war, and occupied territories cannot be recovered instantly. For this reason, although the progress may seem small to us when we consider the situation, military ammunition levels, and possibilities of both sides, the progress of the Ukrainians is quite successful. The most important statements on this subject were made by the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine. And Amelia reported that Ukrainian forces recaptured an area of 28.4 kilometers squared last week, bringing the total gain of the counterattack currently to 158 kilometers squared. Ukrainian Army spokesman Sergei Sharavathy said his troops had advanced more than a kilometer against the Russian forces near the eastern city of Bakhmut in recent days. His comments were the latest to signal that the counteroffensive launched by Kiev in early June is making gradual progress. Although Russia's accounts of the conflict in the Bakhmut sector differ from Ukraine's, although the Russians don't accept these explanations, the Ukrainian armed forces continue to show how successful they are, both in Bakhmut and on the front lines near the city. For Ukrainians, one of the main factors in the success of the offensive actions is, of course, Western aid and the modernization of the Ukrainian army's airspace. Every day, thousands of civilian and military drones of the Ukrainian army take off on both sides of the front. These vehicles are reconnaissance attack positions or help commanders coordinate the actions of warriors during battle, according to Kiev. The quantitative advantage of the enemy can be compensated by technological solutions that significantly increase the effectiveness of the army. That's why they believe that the more drones Ukrainian forces have in their airspace, the more they can corner the Russians. Dominating the airspace with UAVs is a fairly simple plan for Kiev, as the Ukrainian armed forces has a very different range of weapons than they had before February 24, 2022. And now, with the military support of the West, the Ukrainian army is at a much better level than it was before the war in terms of airspace and ground attacks. Although we cannot ignore the Western and U.S. support for the Ukrainian military, local Ukrainian military innovation in line with Kiev's plan is also vital to successes against the Russians.